Lynn, you want to take over for us? Thanks again for everyone's patience.
Hey guys, welcome to the Emergency Visions webinar. Our topic today is location-based decision support and how technology has made a difference in the Superstorm Sandy response. Our featured speaker this morning is Ryan Lanclos. Ryan is an industry manager at Esri, the nation's leading developer of geographical information systems. Ryan is here to review the utilization of geographical information systems and location-based decision support systems in the Superstorm Sandy response. The topic is particularly meaningful to the customers and prospects of Emergency Visions, as visualization and location-based support systems play a prominent role in the management of emergency response. Our customers include federal, state, and local organizations utilizing ArcGIS today, as well as planning for its use. Following Ryan's presentation, Sean Smith, President and founder of Emergency Visions, will provide perspective on logistical support systems and their use, not only in the response phase, but throughout the life cycle of emergency management. We have scheduled 30 minutes for today's presentations and will provide time following the presentations for questions. Please feel free to send a question via the chat, the dialog box, and go to webinar, or tweet us using the hashtag EVIWebinar. And you can do that throughout the presentation. Ryan, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks everyone, and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at in the U.S. So thanks for joining us, and I'm happy to be with you today to give you a perspective of how GIS really supported the Hurricane Sandy efforts. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about a couple of key trends that we realized as the event unfolded, and try to show you some very specific examples of organizations that really met those trends, that were really leading the way in those trends. And unfortunately, as much good work that went in with GIS technology, I wanted to highlight all those good use cases, but I tried to pick a few that I think really resonate across the whole landscape to show you some of those patterns. So my role at Esri is the Emergency Management Industry Manager, meaning my role is to really help figure out how people can take the GIS platform that Esri builds, which is very broad base for applicability to all users in cities, counties, local, private, you name it, and make it very usable and attainable for somebody in emergency management. Meaning, how do we align some of the tools? And that's what I'm going to be working on today. It's kind of that perspective of how we've taken some of those technologies and aligning that, and show you what those trends are that we see in emergency management and GIS. My second role within Esri, underneath that umbrella, is also guiding our disaster response program. And Esri's disaster response program is something we do as part of our corporate citizenship, meaning that there's no cost to anybody for requesting support through Esri at our disaster response program. And we support activities globally. Currently right now monitoring the hurricane that went over the Philippines in the last couple of days, for example. And Hurricane Sandy was one of those that we activated for quite heavily and supported users across the U.S. at state, federal, and local levels. And so my perspective on this is really those common asks that we get from this program and our use of the GIS platform to meet those requests. So our goal, as I mentioned, not only from Esri's perspective, but also from this program, is to really help you, our users, and those folks that are faced with the challenge of response and recovery, to make sure that we can connect the right people in the organization to the appropriate data to answer a specific question, and align them with the workflows that they face. So a really good example would be damage assessment. So somebody who's a structural engineer who's trained in how to do damage assessment doesn't need to be a GIS practitioner and knowledge worker, right, who really understands how to do great modeling and the like on the back end, which is that workflow of damage assessment. It takes advantage of this platform underneath the scenes that is really presenting the right data and the workflow to them on a mobile device to be in the field and collecting information. So our goal is to make sure that we help you with that conversation, understand what the workflows are, and help connect all those right dots together in a more meaningful way for folks to use this GIS platform that most people have in place, and make sure that it's configured appropriately to support those workflows. So traditionally, when I say that, the common requests that we typically get are three things. So one is we need help with data, so either finding data or managing the influx of information coming on, especially during a long-term, long-scale disaster. Or even how do we operationalize data, meaning how do we get it out of the file structure in our enterprise or out of a binder and into the hands of those decision makers. So how does that paper-based form get into the hands of the structural engineer in the field to do damage assessment? The other one we typically get asked to support is things around situational awareness. So how do we engage the public with maps appropriately? How do we build viewers that really give situational awareness both internal to the organization as well as our constituents that we're serving? And finally, the last one I put in is very specific, but it's around that data and the workflow, but it's damage assessment. That's a very common task that we get asked to support is, transforming this process that's typically paper and disconnected from the workflow of trying to report information back up through the state or to FEMA into a more electronic-based format that's real-time and dynamic, meaning we can see what's going on in the field and prioritize resources and the like based on that incoming data in a feed form. So those traditionally were the ones that we always get asked to support, but what we saw during Sandy was kind of this transformation of not just supporting the back-end office processes, meaning the data that's out there and making sure the workflows are in place, but it was really a transformation to the front office. So it was how do we start to present the data coming in through these platforms and these collaborative environments in more meaningful ways to the public and to our partners, and really start to exchange information much more appropriately between those trusted partners. So four key trends that we saw during Hurricane Sandy were the idea of the uptake of collaboration, specifically using the cloud technology. So people that are sharing live data services or maps with each other between federal agencies and state agencies and local government, and exchanging information as well. So not just maps and apps, but actual data that people could take on their own and mash up into information. And those information products, those maps or those apps, were changing, right? They weren't the one-size-fits-all application that we typically saw in the past with building out situational awareness viewers or a website. They were becoming much more focused in the way they were delivered. So the intent was much more honed in making a map so that it was much more user-friendly for somebody that's not a GIS power user. Right? Don't present them with a lot of tools. Present them with just the right amount of tools and just the right amount of data to answer a need. And I'll show you some examples of that as well. And then finally, the last two, social media in the crowd continues to trend upward in emergency management and GIS. So I'll give you some examples around how people are looking to consume social media and really engaging the crowd, meaning the citizenry that's out there, using people as sensors around the constituent of the organization to start feeding data back to us to enhance that situation awareness and understanding of what's going on in the event. And then finally, I think was an interesting one, is the idea of storytelling with maps. So we've invested in this data, we have the workflows in place, we're collecting information and exchanging it, but how do we tell the story of what's ongoing with this response? So what's the impact of Hurricane Sandy on a jurisdiction? What's it in comparison to past events, for example? So it puts it in context and really starts to drive home the impact and understanding of what this magnitude really is. And that's important for a lot of reasons with media and the like, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. So let's take a look at these, and I'll give you some examples at a high level of how these trends really came to bear. So starting with collaboration, right, the first one I want to highlight is kind of a story here of a data set that's being managed by, in this case, FEMA, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, put together a modeling task force. And this modeling task force was using the power of GIS on the back end to really model impact of impending Hurricane Sandy on counties. So you'll notice the third chiclet over here on this map on the FEMA GeoPortal was basically a web service. It was a map that was shared publicly through FEMA into this online platform. And so this modeling that was being done was done by power users on the back end, really understanding how to model what the impact, and so you'll see the red, green, and yellow counties escalates the amount of impact expected using the GIS analysis on the back end. Well, that map then was shared out publicly. So this is the gallery where it was at. And you see it's the #1 chosen item here on the FEMA featured content. So this map continued to update. So as the modeling task force ran iterations of this model, as the impact continued, right, they were honing the model. They shared this data back in, and you can see it had about 23,000 views, and I checked the data, so it was about to 24.5 or so. So it's continued to being used, right, in current response and recovery efforts. So this was a data set that would typically live in an organization, now being shared out. And what's being happening there is that people are picking that data up and making their own maps and putting their context, their operational data on top of that landscape. So it's a pretty powerful thing. So let's pick that story up. So looking at the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross, a very similar concept. So the American Red Cross is now publicly pushing map data and information out to the public. Okay, this is data that lives typically in their organization, things like where the shelters are, what's the status of their mobile feeding and operation trucks and the like, being presented up into these map chiclets that are able to be picked up, mashed up, and used in some specific context. Well, the American Red Cross had a really neat partnership. This is a good story. So they picked up the modeling task force work that was being done by FEMA, shared through the FEMA geoportal that we started with, simply connected to that live service into a map that we see here, and now they've overlaid the National Shelter System on top of that. So they are the authoritative owner of the National Shelter System. You've got FEMA coming in with the modeling, and now matched up through different authoritative content providers, we have an information product that's very specific. What's the impact by county? Where are the shelters located for those counties? And now I can interact with this map. I can zoom in, I can zoom out, I can touch one of those counties to see what the impact is, or I can touch one of those map icons to see where the shelters are and what the status. So it seems like a very simplistic example when you look at it, but the power of this is really the idea of collaboration and information sharing using these new cloud technologies has really revolutionized the way that we build maps and build data products. I don't have to go find somebody to email me a shapefile or a spreadsheet anymore. I can simply connect to it and use this in my own map products. So that was one trend I wanted to highlight. The next one is kind of picking up on that map that I just showed you, and it was built for a very specific purpose. That map was really to show what the impacts by counties were and where those shelters were in relation to those impacted counties. It's very focused in what it's done. You didn't see a lot of data or a lot of tools on that map. I can simply interact with it, zoom in, zoom out. Very consumer friendly, which is a change from where we've been in the past. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of really good examples of organizations doing that practice of building specific map apps. And the one management agency. So Maryland has Osprey, which is their application that's there providing situational awareness, both internal to the organization as well as to the public, the members of the community there in the state of Maryland. So this map application is a little bit thicker, right? It's meant to provide a lot of good data resources to somebody that really knows how to turn on and turn off leaders. There's a lot of great content here. So they're showing where the open shelters specifically in Maryland are. They're tracking the remnants of the hurricane as it moved across. You see one of the rain bands there to the north in live radar. And they've also got Category 1 hurricane storm surge turned on. So as we zoom in and out, we get presented with really good relevant information for this event. Now they've invested in the back end. They've built a lot of these connections. They've published this content. They have a great web application with Osprey built out here. But they took it a step farther, and what they've started doing is start to build very specific maps using that same data. So they've invested in that. They've spent time in that platform. And now they're taking that data out and they're starting to deliver it into these very mission-focused maps or apps. So taking that example down a little farther, here's the hurricane shelter map specifically for Maryland. So this was a shelter map that takes that same data from Osprey, and now it strips out some of the other information and just simply shows me where county boundaries are, where the shelters are located, and I can tap on any one of those shelters and get specific information. I can zoom in and zoom out. That's about it. The key thing is the very top, it's simple to use. I find an address or place. I could simply type in a point of interest or type in my address if I lived in the state of Maryland, zoom to my address, and see what shelters are nearby if I was looking for a shelter. Right, so what's really interesting is that we've got a little thicker client that's built with a lot of great data, and then they're taking it into a next level and saying, let's focus in on the task at hand, and let's show people where shelters are located for the hurricane response. Okay, so very interesting concept, and they did this with several other maps. This was just one example of how they've taken that down and being very focused in delivering content. Another good example during the hurricane was the city of Baltimore. So I chose this example because I think it does a very good job of highlighting both the trends that we just covered. So if you'll notice, the first map that's in the top left is that FEMA Modeling Task Force Hurricane Sandy Impact Analysis. And so they've got that same web service being managed by FEMA on the FEMA geoportal, shared across to all their organizations, and now City of Baltimore can make that specific to their geography. So they've picked up that data set, they've made a web application, a map that uses that live, and now they've got a map that they're sharing to show what the impact is over the City of Baltimore based on that modeling being done by FEMA, the owner. So very interesting, right? But they've also then taken it a step farther. Now each of these little map chiclets launch a very specific map. So if I'm looking where the active hurricane, I can launch that web map and just see where the active hurricane is, what's the cone of uncertainty in the trend, or where the floodplain is, or the inundation map for the city of Baltimore based on this planning. So I like this gallery concept because it just presents me with a menu of options as a citizen. I can land on this page, I can pick the map that I have an interest in, interact with the map, go back to the gallery, maybe pick another map and use it. I don't have to sift through a lot of data, right? It's all being managed in the back end on this platform. But City of Baltimore has made it much easier for me as a consumer to take this data and really understand what the impact is to me personally. So I really like this gallery concept of using maps that are focused for the event. Now, City of Baltimore actually changes out. They have several galleries here that work. So if you go to the City of Baltimore's website, they have these storm maps, but these change out, right? So they can dynamically change this gallery as the event unfolds. Right? So as the story changes, they can present relevant maps or applications to the citizens to come in and pick up those web maps as appropriate. So this is not a static gallery. It's very dynamic in the way they deliver content. And then the last thing I would focus on in these idea of very good user-friendly focus maps and apps is the way the media started to pick up on these trends as well. Right, so these maps are just different examples of very focused applications that were picked up by media outlets, either from Esri, but oftentimes using the data coming off of these platforms from FEMA, from the state of Maryland, you know, those types of examples, and actually embedding those into web application or web properties that general people across the U.S. and the world are reading. Right? So the one you see here is CBS News. There was AP. You've got the local news there in Washington, D.C. showing road closures and a map, and then MSN. And so if we do a really good job of making consumer-friendly, really focused maps and apps, they resonate extremely well with those people who aren't really versed in GIS. They just need good information to understand what the impact is and make a decision on their own. So that concept of focused maps and apps works for the citizens that we serve, but it also should work for internal to the organization. So if I'm supporting an emergency response agency, I want to make sure that the operations director has the right map for him to manage tactical operations for a response. Or conversely, I want to make sure that the logistics chief has the right map and tools to manage those resources, to task resources and find the appropriate resource based on what the operations guy is feeding us. Right? So we can build very focused maps and apps internally, aligned to the organization, just as we would do for the public. So that's a really good trend that's taking off, and so I wanted to highlight some very quick examples with that. Okay, the next trend that really continues, it's something that started several years back and is really starting to hit mainstream for us in emergency management, is the idea of integration of social media and the crowd to our business processes. So the first one I want to highlight is a small town in Long Island area, so the town of Huntington, New York. So Huntington, New York used kind of a crowdsourcing app, if you will, a mobile application that lived on a device that people could come in and touch a URL, and they could help input information about tree damage and inventory. Right? So there, if you see the map on the top left, all those points of information were things where point and features were collected by people in the field saying trees are down, I need some debris removal and the like. Well, what's interesting is it wasn't just using the citizens and showing the citizens we have a bunch of points where damage has been reported, but it's then putting that into practice. So the map on the bottom right was the way they use that information. So they're saying, we've collected a lot of this data from you, the citizens, and our folks in the field are collecting this data. But now we actually show you where we're planning debris cleanup based on that input. So the map on the bottom right changed over time. So this is a dynamic map that Michael and team kept up to date. And they show street segments, and they're saying the number of passes that have gone through. So you can expect a pass in your neighborhood at this time. And they could say it's been one pass when they're planning the second pass and the like. So as they continue debris removal, they're not only telling you some metrics about how bad this was to set expectations. So if you read the text there, they're talking about the number of trees that were down on their website and comparing to past events such as Irene and the like, and saying this was a big event, so please give us time. Here's where we're currently working. You can expect us here in your neighborhood, and we're going to update this map at this time. They're going to show what on December 1st the next update will come in. So a very interesting way to say we're using you citizens to help collect information about where to prioritize our response, but it's also communicating effectively back to the crowd saying, we've listened, we're using our resources effectively to help respond, this is when you can expect updates. Please check back here to see where we're at. So a really good example, I thought, and this was a small town, so not a big FEMA or an organization, and I don't mean that in a meaning way. This is a very small town that really understood how to connect with a good, meaningful map product and work it into that process of communicating both internally in the organization as well as telling the public what we're working on. So definitely doable at all scales. So the next one I want to talk about is an application that was a prototype we worked on with the state of Rhode Island. It was how do they start to engage citizens to collect information about damage, about the need for gas, which was a major issue after Sandy in the Northeast, and about power, for example. Do I have power? Do I not have power? So citizens, naturally want to yell at somebody. They want to be able to tell you what they're feeling, what's going on, what they're experiencing. And so if we can engage them appropriately with the crowd, we can start to really get an interesting data set that provides another layer of information that we can filter through to help drive some of our analysis and understanding of the event. So this was a mobile application, so not a thick, nobody had to install anything. I didn't have to go to an app store and get an app. This is something that was built specifically to work on any mobile device, so it's a JavaScript, so those out there that are coders, this was a JavaScript HTML5 application. It works on an iPad, it works on an Android device, it works on a Windows device, and it scales to screen size, so it can work on an iPad or an Android tablet or an iPhone. Right, so the idea is here that you can share this URL. I can send this URL on our website. I can use social media to tweet out this link to our constituents, give it to the media to distribute. And essentially all it is when I come here, it says, this doesn't reflect our emergency service, call 911 if you have a problem. But if you'd like to tell us about damage and help us understand what the impact is to the community, use this application. And simply by big button touch, I can put in either my address or use the GPS on the device itself. So on that smartphone or tablet, you can use the GPS-enabled capabilities to capture a location. And then simply go to the next phase, which is these little radio buttons you see in the third panel. I can select, do I have minor, major structural damage? And this is all qualitative for the citizen, right? This isn't a structural engineer doing the assessment. It's simply letting a citizen tell us kind of what they're seeing right at their location. So are there down power lines? Is there fuel spilled? Do you have power or not? So this can be dynamically changed. This collection here, these radio buttons, can be changed out based on the event. So maybe there's a specific data set you'd like the citizenry to help collect. Simply changing the structure can change this little menu here. And then they go to the next page and they can voluntarily submit their information if they'd like. So I can enter a phone number and a contact, and we'll follow up saying, hey, we've received your response, and that could be an automated email, for example. But it's not required, so simply just tell us there's a point with some damage. And then they can upload pictures. So I could take a picture of the damage that I think is major of my facility, and I can take that photo of down power line of the tree down, and then submit that. And what that went to is a database on the back end into that platform that was then presented back to the facility in the operations center saying, these are the points being collected by the citizenry. And so the idea was that we could start to get a point collection of damage from the citizens. We could aggregate that into clusters to say these are where people are reporting major or minor damage for the like, and then use that to help build context around some of our authoritative content. So the 911 to say here's the picture of what we think damage is for the community and how we should now start to prioritize our response and recovery. So an interesting way to think about it, so make it easy for the user. Don't make them have to install something or go to an app store. Just simply, we can put a web app out there. They can touch that URL and then start sending us information that we can then take into context of all the others to really determine our next action. And then the last one I want to touch on is the social media. So it's not, I'm not engaging the citizens there, the crowd, with a specific task to collect me information, right? And I'm giving them a choice of radio buttons to send me some data back. This is the idea that I can actually now use social media where people are talking about everything under the sun. Right? And if you've ever tracked Twitter or Flickr or YouTube or Instagram, people like to take pictures and everything from food to their family open a picture to this flooded street. And so you get a little bit of everything when you use social media. And that's kind of the beauty of social media, is that this just gives you a very good landscape picture of what people are talking about in relation to a specific geography and in relation to a specific event. So this map here was one that's using a free template that was built. It's showing evacuation points. The red dots are evacuation centers for New York City. The red, green, and yellow are the evacuation zones for the city of New York. And then overlaid on that are the social media clusters. So those little green clusters are social conversations around anything with a hashtag of Sandy or hurricane or mentioning the words Sandy or hurricane. Okay. So it's geography bounded, meaning it's searching just within the map extent. And it's also filtering out that river of information coming from social media. So that's the people talking about everything from I drank a hurricane at the bar to I'm really affected by Hurricane Sandy. Right? Two different conversations, but both using the same social media. We can filter that down and now take a look and start to page through these, see what people are posting in terms of pictures on Instagram or looking at YouTube videos, what tweets are coming in and people are saying that. So what's the sentiment? Right? Are there positive or negative sentiment around these different parts of town? So again, it's not really meant to drive operations. It's really another layer of information that can be mashed into our understanding to really start to drive kind of an on-the-ground picture of what people are being faced with. So I'd leave that with you as an example. And what's neat about these templates is that that map that I just showed you was something that was built in collaboration with City of New York and Esri, but it's just one template. So that template is made available for anybody to use in these kind of collaborative environments. So this map here was something created by a citizen. So Tom Malmay picked his own map. He put in some counties, so he's got some county data here showing impact. And this was searching, right? Those freely available information sharing success stories that we talked at the very first have been picked up. And he's built his own map that tells the story he's looking to tell. And then he simply published that map into this free template, and now the social media clusters show up. He can change the keywords to search on, so maybe it's not Hurricane Sandy, maybe it's power outage that he wants to search for. Right, so now he can start to build a map that tells a story, but it's taking advantage of all those authoritative content sources being shared collaboratively. So a really neat way to tie social media back to where we started is in terms of trends. All right, so the last thing I'd like to focus on is now we've got those information sharing initiatives underway. We've got the collaborative environment. We've seen how focus maps and apps can really resonate with citizens as well as internal to organizations. But really it's about how do we tell a good story of the event itself. And it's really interesting because media picks up on that, citizens pick up on the idea of the story, and we could really start to tell people how we're responding, right? Putting this in context. So I kind of go back to the idea that the town of Huntington, right? They said and put context and words around this event here for Hurricane Sandy left X amount of trees down, which in comparison to where you saw us respond in X number of days for Hurricane Irene, this should give you some comparison, right? Set expectations and really tell the story of what this impact is. And so I'd like to give you a couple examples of storytelling templates and maps that were built for Hurricane Sandy because I think they're kind of interesting. So the first one, this was released beforehand. So before Hurricane Sandy actually hit the East Coast, this was a story map that was built, and NOAA had done a study examining the top 10 most damaging hurricanes over U.S. history. Right? So over all time in U.S. history, when they started tracking, where are the 10 most deadly or damaging hurricanes? So we can simply show you tracks and show where the top 10 were, and I can click on the most damaging 1 through 10. And the map changes for each one, so number 10 I could look at, number 9. But what's interesting is that the study not only said this was most damaging in 1926, where we're looking at the Great Miami Hurricane, but what's that cost or estimated damage today in dollars? So looking for inflation and the like, what's that impact? And the number of deaths. And then a little bit of text about that. So taking a paper report that a lot of us are familiar with, putting in context of now a story map binder where I could click through different chapters of a book, really starts to present that geography as a story. So if a picture tells 1,000 words, is the old adage, a map tells 1,000,000, right? So maps really bring relevance and make things that are hard to understand contextually individual perspective. And that's what we're looking at here is a map story that was done with that 10 most damaging hurricanes. So setting context of where Sandy could fall as it's moving forward. The next one I thought was a really nice example of storytelling was a little different tack. So FEMA worked with the Civil Air Patrol. They were capturing photographs along the East Coast, and an immense number of photographs along the East Coast, like tens of thousands of photographs along the East Coast. And so as these points were collected and imagery was being flown, the idea was that citizens who had to be evacuated from Long Island or from New Jersey who weren't able to see what the impact was on their home, right? They're displaced. They're wondering what's the impact, and they probably haven't seen home in several days. The idea was here I could put in an address. I can zoom to that address location, and I can see if there's any photos nearby. So what we're looking at here is imagery that's being shown. So this is post-event imagery that we're seeing here as the backdrop, the canvas. That's being flown and then served out, so now you can see pre- and post-event imagery. But I also can click on any of the green dots, and I can see an oblique view that the Civil Air Patrol has captured. So perhaps they're looking in my direction. I can see if they're nearby. Just get a context around my neighborhood, what the potential impact is. So I'm telling the story to the citizens. We understand that you've been displaced. We know that you're worried about getting home, and maybe you can't get back home yet, but we're trying to give you information, at least understand what's there. Do we need to start contacting folks and the like? So another interesting way, this map was picked up and kind of went kind of like wildfire throughout the community because it provided really good context to citizens. Type an address, show me something about my address. The next map that I want to show is along that same line. So this was something that was built to show the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy over specific areas. So if you're watching the news, you saw they were talking about New Jersey along the shoreline. They were talking about the boardwalk being completely wiped out. You were talking about New York City. You were talking about Brooklyn and Long Island. And so what this did was take some of those key areas where people were talking about immense damage and destruction and start to put it in context through a before and after. So I can simply tap on the bookmarks at the top, and the bookmarks drop down to some of those key areas like the New Jersey area, the boardwalk, or going out to Long Island here to Breezy Point, where we're looking at right now. And I could drag the image left or right. So on the left, I'm presented with pre-event imagery. So this is the status quo for Breezy Point. As I drag over to the right-hand side, now I'm seeing the post-event. So you'll notice there's the fire that occurred in Breezy Point. So now I've got context around number of homes that have been damaged and the like. So a visual tour that relates to those very specific areas of focus that were being highlighted in the media. And then finally, one of the last ones I want to give as an example is, taking advantage of that platform, the good GIS work that most of us do to drive analysis and really presenting that analysis in a consumer-friendly way. So the modeling task force was a really good example. And so what we've done is taken that same story that we started with of that map that's shared by the FEMA Modeling Task Force on the FEMA GeoPortal. And we've overlaid that with some analysis data to show who and what's impacted in that area, which is kind of an interesting story. So the base map you're seeing here is just a simple base map that's clean. I've got the purple, red, yellow, green. And then we're looking underneath that at some demographic data, some consumer data that's underneath it. So if I were to click on any of those areas, so I've clicked on a certain section of the map here. In this case, we're looking at Queens County, New York. We can see what the population was as of the census in 2010. And specifically, it's not maybe looking for vulnerable population. So we're looking at older population, 65 plus, that percentage of that population that constituent brings up, as well as then maybe a demographic pie chart. So I can mouse over those cursor pie chart pieces and see what the different age breakdown is or the demographics that are being reported. And maybe it's home ownership as the next tab. So we can start to tell a story around this impact using that analysis was done by FEMA and now putting other data behind it for context. So over 64 years of age, the number of home ownerships in those different areas. So a lot of the story was that people were out on parts of the coast were actually vacationers, right? They weren't full-time homes. So it's interesting to see that's home ownership versus renters and the like. The median home value, the household income. So we're starting to see a little bit about the segment of the population that may be affected in different areas, which has a direct impact on the need and resources we provide. And diversity. So diversity is interesting as well. So if I'm looking at sending in a response team to a certain part of town that's potentially impacted, what's the diversity or what's the primary language? And this is another good story. As folks are working in Staten Island, the idea came up of what languages are predominant in certain areas. Do we need to send translators along with recovery teams to make sure they can communicate effectively with the citizens in those different areas? So the storytelling behind this is that we've got a map that was built using authoritative content from FEMA. They were the owners. They are the ones that are the provider of that data, picked up and mashed up into this little storytelling application to say what the impact was across a couple of different key indicators. All right, so those 4 trends, there were some really neat lessons learned as I kind of wrap up here and transfer back to the team. So lessons learned. Number 1 is I think we can really focus on preparedness on the front end, and that is think about some of these maps and apps that worked really well, that resonated with citizens, that resonated within organizations, and create some template maps and apps that are ready to go. Right? So the idea behind that Rhode Island example, so we are going to take that little template that was built to do crowdsourcing and start working on making that available as a free template that people can start, plug a data source on the back end and be able to use that as a starting point template to be on the road to being better prepared. And that's really important because those templates, maps, and apps, I think we need to take the time to really align them with the mission that we're trying to address. So that means if I've got something I'm working with the citizens on and engaging them, let's make sure we have the map that's aligned to that workflow. If it's the damage assessment app where I've got a process really well defined in my organization that follows a paper-based standard collection form and some reporting output in a spreadsheet, let's make sure that we have a template that aligns to that so that the structural engineer doesn't have to learn something new. It simply looks very familiar to them and it captures the same information they're trained on, just maybe in a digital format on a smartphone. And so we can do those things in advance and really start to drive into those mission requirements to make sure that we have free maps and apps ready to go. And there are some templates to get started. So I mentioned the first part of this, of what Esri does with our disaster response program, is really try to understand what those mission requirements are and how we can help address the very common requests that we get. And so there are some free templates for things like situational awareness and for damage assessment that are available on a resource center for folks to download, to customize, take the source code on your own and build out your own expertise into it and be off and running. So our goal is to not have to reinvent the wheel, is to give you a leg up and help start. So if you have questions about that, we're happy to support. And then the next part is not only focus on those with creating that, but be specific about those maps and apps that you start to think about. You know, what are the questions we're trying to answer? Who's the audience? Where are they going to access this map or application? And that's really an important thing to think about now, because as smartphones and mobile devices really start to continue to take over our market, we need to think about how do we make sure that a map that we view on a desktop in the operations center works just the same way on an iPhone with a much smaller real estate in terms of screen. And I go back to that example from Rhode Island again. Make sure that it's scalable and workable so that somebody can touch it on any device and still get the right user experience that they need to collect the appropriate information. And then finally, you know, what data do you need to make them all work? So if we've got the idea that we're going to build these focused templates and have these kind of ready to light up when the time comes, and we know what questions we're answering, that should natively drive us to what's the data that we need. Either we're going to be collecting data from somebody to answer questions, but we have a data model in mind, so it's I want to know debris, I want to know trees down, I want to know power on or off. Right? Some of those specific things can be modeled in advance, and then you can have the infrastructure and the platform in place ready to go so that these maps are there, ready to turn on and disseminate to the right person at the right time to support their workflow. So with that, I'm going to pause at this point. I'm going to say thank you from my perspective on this, and if you'd like to learn more about the Esri Disaster Response Program, the URL's on the screen, or feel free to email me or catch me on Twitter as well for more detailed information on some of these, and more specifically to connect to those users in the field that are doing all the great work. But I tried to highlight some of those high-level points, and again, I can't emphasize enough the great work that folks were doing in the field using GIS technology to really manage this immense event on the East Coast. And so I'm blown away to be able to work with some of these folks. So thank you for letting me visit with you, and I'm going to transfer back to Sean and team for a wrap-up before we take questions.
Thank you, Ryan. We do have some questions. Very powerful information, particularly in the context of Superstorm. I'm going to turn it over to Sean. Sean is the president, founder of Emergency Vision. I'm going to take a few minutes to describe the use of logistical response technology to save property and lives in the full life cycle of emergency management. So with that, we'll turn this over to Sean. We do have a couple of questions at the end, so we're going to re-engage you to it, Ryan.
And thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks for everyone for participating. Emergency Visions is honored to be a strategic partner with Esri for location-based decision support, specifically in the area of logistics. And kind of what we wanted to focus on is just to take the idea, and Ryan's given us some great post-Sandy kind of efforts of using geospatial technology and really making a difference in the response. And I really love the social media and the crowdsourcing kind of maps, food for thought, that and the assessment tools. But in the area specifically where we are as partners with Esri is in logistics. And of course, everyone knows that we're in the recovery phase right now within the life cycle of this event post-Sandy. And we're about to head into the mitigation phase, which I'll close with in a slide in just a second. But what we saw with respect to our clients and some of the other folks that were out there that might have benefited from a combination of emergency response logistics data that's visualized through the ArcGIS platform were the following kind of logistical challenges. Immediately after the landfall, you saw people that were in search of very vital things, generators for power issues, pumps to pump the water out. We heard all about the stories of fuel being in short supply throughout the region, and certainly gas stations that didn't have the power to be able to pump the fuel. There are folks that needed pretty immediately water and shelf-stable meals in order for their basic subsistence. And of course, sheltering kind of supplies, comfort kits, sanitation kits were in need. And then folks started to muster into the area that were, so they were in need of credentialed responders and volunteers that understood how to operate in these debris affected areas within the area. So the logistical challenges were really getting resources into that affected area on a timely basis. As the transportation infrastructure was severely affected throughout the area, issues of how to get around and with the debris, with roads being down, bridges being affected. Certainly the power infrastructure made it difficult in order to communicate with the folks in the area, and the telecommunications infrastructure having its damage. We also experienced some delays in decision-making, where where points of distribution were going to be activated and where people could muster up for resources and assistance. How different responders and power crews from the utilities were mustering into the area. The delays in decision-making and being able to activate the response plans that were out there, and it had even been exercised on in the past, didn't quite happen on a timely basis, and that made a logistical challenge. And then in general, there was a lack of visibility into where do I get these things? Where do I get the generators? Where can I get more of them? What are my mutual aid partners doing, and could I access their resources? And what about my nonprofit partners, folks from the Red Cross or the Salvation Army or other folks that are the Baptists with mobile kitchens? How can I start serving my populace a little bit better? And logistically, how do I get these resources and volunteers quickly into my area? Technology literally could have made a difference. Utilizing technology such as ArcGIS and with emergency response logistics technology like we provide with our response vision technology, you could have visualized the supplier resources. You could have identified them already before the event occurred and be able to quickly visualize them through the maps of where there are more of these things and how quickly can I then procure them and get them shipped over to where they need to be. Physical resources and responsive volunteer teams could be easily tracked and managed through a situation like this. Response and recovery efforts could be visualized by location, and the folks that were there that were activated to operate there and to work there could have been visualized and coordinated more easily with ArcGIS. Interagency collaboration and coordination would become more clear and concise, and in general, a common operating picture, whether it's out in the field from a mobile phone or an iPad or on your traditional bigger scale system where you can see maps like you see in the center of the screen, that's really going to foster the right kind of decision making behind that common operating picture, so that the data from logistics, and 90% of what you do in response to emergency is all about moving people and things. Visualization technology makes the movement of those people and things much more coordinated, concise, and effective. Now we have an opportunity for you. You probably already heard that Governor Cuomo in New York has requested $9.1 billion in mitigation resources, and FEMA immediately responded and said every dollar spent in mitigation would have saved $4 in the actual response effort. So you're about to see some money come into the affected area regarding mitigation, and these funds for a mitigation solution could actually offer immediate value. Well, how? Well, you could start cataloging and visualizing the existing recovery and restoration suppliers and credentialed personnel that are operating within your community. So it provides immediate value, helps to mitigate the risk for the next event, and improve your readiness. You can obtain immediate visibility and situational awareness through ArcGIS for restoration, resource, and team tracking. The technologies with combined emergency visions and Esri solution would help you to utilize financial accounting and reimbursement tools for post-Sandy actions, and all this kind of data could flow right back into an integrated THIRA and for modifications to your incident action plans and hazard mitigation plans, which are a requirement for funding receipt in fiscal year 2013. The system, a combined solution, would foster collaboration. It's really a whole community approach, which opens the door for technology implementations through your other whole community partners, your utilities that are restoring, and your NGOs that are operating in your area. Agencies would get daily productive use of the system beyond just a catastrophic event. It would have applicability for a situation, regular structural fires and other things in your community. And it's cloud-based, so it can operate in a disconnected environment for field operations, but also link up to all the great stuff that happens in the cloud that Esri's getting so good at, and that we are too in the area of resource management. So get ready for the funding coming down the pike, and hopefully take advantage of that to help move these things forward. We're kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to move it back up to the first slide here, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to turn it back over to Paul Noon for questions to Ryan.
Hey, Ryan, I think you may have covered this during we do have a couple of questions that came in, and one of the first questions was, and I believe you did have a slide on this, but does Esri or other organizations, agencies that you work with, present guidelines on interface design and presentation for GIS data? So I think one of your recommendations was to provide templates to align with the mission of organizations, so that the data that is sourced through social media does allow for the appropriate visualization of data points. But if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, that would be helpful.
Sure, absolutely. So very briefly, yes, we do provide some guidance on that. And a good example is around situational awareness. And I mentioned, as you described, being specific in the way we build maps and apps, and make sure that the operations chief or logistics chief has the right data. And so we've done quite a bit of work with several of our users, as well as taking guidance from DHS under their geospatial continuity operations, the geospatial ConOps document that's out there, and really try to align those so that if you were to take this guidance document as a starting point, you would know essentially what key data sets need to be in for operations, logistics, planning, and on. And so we can provide that to you guys as well, and maybe back to Sean and Paul and team, we'll make sure that those resources and links are available. So we have a very high-level document that outlines that concept, and then we're working on some very specific templates and tools that can guide you on that path as you move forward.
Super, Ryan. Sean, there's another question here that says, how do you expect the social media crowdsourcing will affect logistical responses in future events? The example, fuel, food, resources, assistance. And are there examples of this in the Sandy response?
Oh, absolutely there are. And Ryan, I'm going to tie you into this question too. We're seeing needs. We certainly saw needs for, as I mentioned, generators and pumps and fuel and stuff. But there's a great site right now. It's a Twitter site called NYC Sandy Needs, and you'll see actually needs for everything from they're dealing with a lot of mold issues right now up in the areas where there was a lot of flood damage. So they're asking for things like N95 masks, for dehumidifiers, for cleaning supplies and equipment, for cleaning organizations, for winter clothing, blankets and cots, construction materials, things like that. So folks, I think Ryan mentioned language issues there. People are asking on this Twitter site for language translators. So there's a clear need for resources, whether it's supplies or equipment or credentialed personnel. And certainly through, that's a logistical need in terms of being able to catalog those things, and also being able to figure out how to get them where they need to be. So having a tool like ArcGIS to be able to gather that crowdsourced data and be able to visualize the locations of where there are folks that are providing services or products that are needed, I think would be of great benefit. Ryan, you want to add in on that?
Yeah, and very briefly, I think the question of, do we respond to one tweet coming in with a need for water, or do we look at a mass number and where the trend of tweets occurs to really help prioritize resources, is a big question in emergency management. And what we saw during Sandy was reporting or aggregating tweets and crowdsource information by U.S. National Grid Cell. And specifically, FEMA is reporting everything by grid cell, so they are focused on, is it hot or cold in that cell, right, based on needs. So we started to think about, don't really have to respond to the one tweet, which is really challenging for emergency management people to focus on, right? Is it a valid tweet? Is it a valid person? Or are they trying to be disruptive in what they're tweeting? Versus I can put that one tweet in the context of the other 1,000 that are coming in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Breezy Point, and look at them aggregatively to see where the hot spots are for need. And then I can drive into those specific tweets and maybe start looking at what the need is. So just as Sean described, is Is it water? Is it clothing? Is it translation? Then I can start to really prioritize what resources need to go to those specific areas and get those validation points in the field. So yeah, good response. I don't have much to add other than think of it in the context of all of them. We have to focus on the one tweet, which is still really challenging for folks.
Hey, Ryan, there's an interesting question here is, from a social media perspective, do we have any sense of, was there any false data provided? And I think certainly what you mentioned, yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so one quick example. So there was a photo that went out of one of the metro stations in Manhattan. So you remember the waterfall kind of cascading down, and so there was a picture that got tweeted out, and essentially that was a photoshopped picture that got picked up and retweeted and sent out. So it trended upward, showing this mass water influx into the metro station. Well, that wasn't actually the case, and so I go back to the idea of looking at the aggregate, not the single tweet. And so from a decision point perspective, we need to think about what's that one tweet in context of other. If I've got 4 or 5 different photos from Instagram, and maybe I've got people talking on Twitter or Flickr, and they're coming from different angles, and I can just, same view of the same location based on those different areas and different people talking about it, then maybe I want to pay attention. There's something going on. But, having that one tweet and not having context of that one tweet is really challenging, and that's where the power of disruption really kicks in. And so I think that's the ask, and what the emergency management folks are really focused on is how do we take all those tweets and make sure that we're focused on the problem areas, not the one anomaly that may be disruptive and misinformation. So putting those in context and looking at them aggregatively is really helpful.
Very helpful, Ryan. One last question here, and then I'm going to sort of conclude. And if there are other questions that we aggregate after this, I'll make sure as a follow-up we'll get those questions and answers to the entire group. But the last question is really, how large or how big does an organization need to be in order to take advantage of these types of tools? And is it cost prohibitive for a smaller municipality or organization, NGO, that might be involved in response? And I'll ask Sean to start, and then Ryan, if you could finish that off for our last question.
Well, it's a good question. The technology, I'm going to toot a little bit of Esri's horn here with ArcGIS Online is such a cost-effective solution, and using the cloud-based approach as we're doing with Emergency Visions as well, really allows you to provide strategic and valuable technology at a very cost-effective price point. So even smaller communities, even the folks with volunteer-based resources can benefit from having a common operating picture and a logistical solution for cataloging the human and physical assets that they have that would be utilized in an emergency response situation. So that doesn't really matter if it's a small organization all the way up to a large state or federal organization. I think the technologies apply in either. And Ryan, your thoughts on that?
I think you hit the exact point. The technology applies, and the use cases and the best practices apply across all levels of government. And whether you're a FEMA with a full enterprise deployment and using the cloud, and you have your own servers and IT support staff, and you've got a network of folks to call on, versus that one town in New York that we focus on, which is a smaller community, and I truthfully don't know much about the size of the organization, but looking at geography, right, a much smaller community that's still able to take advantage of these practices and tools and put them into play. And the cloud really brings that to bear too. I think you on it is that the cloud gives people a much easier way into kind of this platform concept without having to rely on infrastructure internally and the people to manage it and be servers up and running, which can really be cost prohibitive for some locations. So there are different entry points that we see along this path of a GIS enterprise, if you will, from, I need somebody with one person supporting a desktop and maybe a small organization, all the way up to I'm managing lots of servers on my side because I want it all internal. And so that continuum is really meant to be along a pathway that people can start at one end and work their way to the other end as appropriate.
Ryan, fantastic. We appreciate everyone's time today on the call, Ryan, Sean, especially for your content. We look forward to speaking with all of you guys in the future on our future webinars. Our next webinar will be January 9th, and it will be focused on the public-private partnership, really using the whole community approach for capacity builds. Feel free to reach out directly to us at emergencyvisions.com or follow us at EVI webinar, #EVI webinar. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.